Hundreds of people on Sunday brought their fight against sexual violence to the heart of Hollywood.
Rise up for the women of the world, for the women of the world, rise up.
The march was centered around the hashtag #MeToo movement, bringing awareness to sexual harassment. Tarana Burke founded it more than a decade ago.
The Me Too movement began in 2006. The creator, Tarana Burke, is a Black activist from the Bronx. She encountered a Black girl who shared her story of sexual violence and abuse. Soon she found herself meeting dozens more. As a survivor herself, these were stories with which she identified personally. Tarana faced the realization that too many girls were suffering and surviving abuse without access to resources, safe spaces, and support. Burke wanted to create a movement through the empowerment through empathy by changing the way the world thinks and talks about sexual violence, consent, and body autonomy. She created the phrase Me Too as a way to offer solidarity to young Black girls who've survived sexual assault, as she wished she had simply said Me Too to comfort a girl who had shared her story. For nearly a decade, the Me Too functioned as a community-based activism rooted in healing, mentorship, and survivor support. It was not yet a social media phenomenon, but grassroots efforts to give survivors, especially survivors of color, a voice. The movement continued and went mainstream in 2017 after actress Alyssa Milano encouraged survivors to post Me Too on social media following the Harvey Weinstein investigation. Within a single day, millions of people publicly identified themselves as survivors. This sudden flood of stories transformed what had been a quiet, community-focused campaign into a global conversation about sexual violence, power, and accountability. The explosion of the hashtag #MeToo mattered because it introduced a new form of social awareness. People weren't just reading individual stories, they were recognizing a collective pattern. As more and more survivors spoke out, society began to confront how common sexual violence really is and how often institutions and communities have failed to protect victims or take their experiences seriously. How judgment worked during the hashtag #MeToo. Before hashtag #MeToo, society's judgment was deeply flawed. Society often judged survivors through harmful and unrealistic questions. People asked survivors why didn't they speak up sooner, what they were wearing, or why they didn't have physical evidence, or why they didn't fight back. Survivors were judged according to impossible expectations, which meant their stories were often dismissed before they were even heard. The Me Too movement changed how credibility was measured. Instead of focusing on the idea that each individual story needed physical proof, people began to see credibility in the consistency of thousands of similar narratives. Survivors from different backgrounds described similar patterns of manipulation, silence, intimidation, and institutional neglect. Their stories were taken together and became a powerful form of evidence.
Old former doctor was ordered to serve as much as 175 years in prison for abusing young female athletes. Following days of searing testimony, the judge told Nassar he doesn't deserve to walk outside of prison ever again. Here's Dr. John LaPook.
I've just signed your death warrant.
After 156 victims had addressed their abuser, Judge Rosemarie Aquilina got her turn.
An event that occurred in 2018, similar to the Me Too movement, was the Larry Nassar trial. Larry Nassar served as a trusted doctor for USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University. For more than 20 years, he used his medical authority to sexually abuse athletes, many of whom were minors. He disguised his abuse as medical treatment, and his reputation as a respected doctor made it easy for him to avoid suspicion. Larry Nassar wasn't stopped earlier because institutions judged him as credible simply due to his authority and status. Coaches, administrators, police, and university officials let complaints fade away or be dismissed entirely. Their judgments were shaped by Nassar's position of power rather than by the consistent reports coming from young athletes. The turning point came when investigative journalists, particularly from the Indianapolis Star, began gathering survivor accounts. These stories revealed high, consistent patterns, the same abuse techniques, the same excuses, the same environments. This pattern exposed institutional failures and encouraged more survivors to come forward. In 2018, during Nassar's sentence hearing, Judge Rosemary Aquila allowed more than 150 survivors to speak in court. For many years, this was the first time they truly understood the scale of abuse. Hearing survivor after survivor account the same behaviors made it impossible for anyone to deny the truth. First-hand accounts from gymnasts strengthened the evidence as Ali Razman stood in the courtroom and directly confronted Nassar. She said that she and other women had experienced abuse become a force, and she told him that he was nothing. She explained that for years, she and her teammates tried reporting his abuse but were dismissed repeatedly. Institutions believed Nassar over them, despite their consistent warnings. Popular gymnast Simone Biles shared publicly that speaking out was painful but necessary. She emphasized that staying silent meant continuing to suffer, and she highlighted the way institutions protected Nassar because they viewed him as too valuable to question. Michaela Maroney revealed that USA Gymnastics attempted to silence her by offering her money to keep her from speaking publicly about the abuse. She described Nassar's action as evil disguised as care, showing how easily authority figures can manipulate and deceive.
His process has been horrific, but surprisingly therapeutic. I'm addressing you publicly today as a final step and statement to myself that I have nothing to be ashamed of.
My deepest pain and fear was the thought of my 2 young daughters ever being hurt like this.
He took that trust and used it to molest not only myself, but over 140 young girls. Is something I still can't comprehend. I still can't think about without crying. We were just kids. We were just kids.
Connecting the two events and how we form judgments. Patterns create credibility in both events. The Me Too movement and the Nassar trial demonstrate that when many individuals share similar stories, those narratives gain credibility. People stopped doubting each other individually and began recognizing the larger pattern. This shifts from questioning victims individually to understanding collective evidence and was key in both situations. Social media made it possible to bypass institutions. In both Me Too and the Nassar case, survivors used social media and journalism to share their stories when institutions refused to listen. These alternative platforms allowed survivors to create visibility and public pressure. Society began evaluating truth through the lived experiences rather than solely relying on institutional authority. Bias and race shaped how we judge truth. The Me Too movement showed that race played a major role in whose stories became visible. Tarana Burke's activism was overlooked for years and only became amplified when more privileged voices joined. Similarly, the Nassar survivors were often viewed as ideal victims because they were young, elite athletes, which reveals another layer of bias on how society assigns credibility. Judgment is both personal and civic. These events show that forming judgments is not only about individual beliefs. It influences public policy, media coverage, institutional accountability, and even legal outcomes. Choosing who to believe has consequences that extend far beyond a single case. What these events teach us about judgment and accuracy. These events teach us that humans assess truth socially, not just logically. Even when traditional evidence is missing, consistent patterns can reveal powerful truths. They also teach us that people in positions of power often benefit from biases that automatically label them as credible. Race and gender heavily influence whose stories are taken seriously. They show that ethic judgment requires listening, empathy, and awareness of how institutions shape narratives. These cases matter because it teaches us how to judge responsibly. The Me Too movement and the Larry Nassar trial reveal that judgment is shaped by power structures, social biases, and cultural expectations. They remind us that survivors rely on society to listen and respond. They show that race affects who is heard and who is ignored, and proof that when people come together and share their experiences, they can break through decades of denial and forced institutions to change. Understanding how we form judgments help us become more informed citizens, more ethical listeners, and more responsible members of our community.